Like so much in life, the more one pursues answers, the more questions tend to build up. RMS Lusitania is no exception to this phenomenon. Answers are like a breadcrumb trail, leading the researcher onwards and forward. Any individual working on his or her own can unearth a remarkable amount of information with sufficient determination and time. However, sometimes it makes far more sense and saves far more time to meet with individuals who have long been at the core of the subject and whose knowledge is a sea that runs deep. In mid-September, we travelled to meet Paddy O'Sullivan in his hometown. If there ever was an oracle of all things Lusitania, then this succinctly describes Paddy. Paddy O'Sullivan, first of all, thank you very much for affording us this time this afternoon to talk about Lusitania. I'm sure you're black and blue with it at this stage.
My pleasure.
Okay, this is a bit like having an audience with the Pope or Julio Iglesias. Anyway, we're here with Paddy O'Sullivan, who most people would contend is the paragon of all things to do with Lusitania. Paddy, just to kick things off, how did you get into technical diving in the first place, and when was that?
Possibly around 1972, 73. I was an air diver at Bigam all the time, and then when I joined John Light, I was changing over to technical. Mm-hmm. But the operation collapsed financially after about a year and a half, so no actual dives were made on the helium equipment. The Lusitania is too deep for compressed air divers. There's a phenomenon called nitrogen narcosis, and you're no better than a drunken man breathing air at depth, 300 feet especially. You're absolutely useless, and diving was a poor man's game until the oil business developed. Was the oil brought on diving, they had the money, the millions to make the equipment, the chambers, everything. So then a lot of the sport divers now dive on helium and mixed gas for clarity, clear head. You begin to get fuzzy at 100 feet.
Okay, and one of the you've already mentioned him. One of the key figures back in those days, back in the 60s, was this chap called John Light. How did you manage to get involved with John Light in the first place?
John came in the 60s with a meagre budget. He had about 6 divers. He made 42 dives to the Lusitania on compressed air. They didn't know what they were doing and where they were going due to narcosis, which you get if you're diving deep, from nitrogen, and they achieved very little. They were especially hampered with poor lighting, then the underwater lights then were hopeless. And the conclusion of the findings was nil, really. He was trying to prove that munitions blew up the ship. He had all sorts of plans, but he just had the wrong gear, wrong equipment. And while in Kinsale, he met and married Muriel Light. That's where he met his wife.
And if you could, it might be a slightly tricky question. Describe John Light as a person as best you can.
John Light was a brash American. He was an ex-Marine, and he was in the American Navy. Spoke very loudly through an outhailer, giving orders to his crew in the morning. He had difficulty organising working schedules, getting goods on time and so on. He was highly skilled in archives and research, and a very persuasive guy. So when he was researching Lusitania, he was funded then by NBC television. He left Kinsale, lived in London, and he called around to the British Admiralty, the people that would have the information, and he was a very persuasive guy. If you were trying to keep a secret, he would wheeze it out eventually. So he was good at research. He recorded everything, and he could never finish. He was looking for more and more all the time, and eventually time caught up with him.
Yeah, sounds like an interesting chap.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. That was the first wave of diving. He came in the early 70s with the helium kit, decompression chambers, the whole shebang. And I think one of his mistakes was to try and build that complex off Kinsale Pier. It would be far more efficient to go to a shipyard where you have shipwrights, they modify ships and all that. But there was cost overruns and delays and lovely calm weather for diving when we couldn't dive because the work wasn't complete. And his consultant was Hans Keller of Switzerland. He was a scientist, but he seemed to be associated with the company who were supplying John Light with the decompression chamber and the diving chamber and the diving equipment. He was changing over to helium breathing for clear head, but the operation fell asunder before there was time.
Mm-hmm. I'm a photographer myself, but how difficult was underwater photography back in those days?
Difficult enough because the cameras weren't developed. It was a surface camera in a waterproof case, which had a lot of shortcomings. Also, the lighting was handheld lighting and poor lighting. A diver with one lamp isn't much good. You need 7 or 8 lamps to light up the whole place. But he was a bit early for the technology, especially the kind of stuff we have nowadays.
And just going back, staying back in the 1960s, was the wreck back then pretty much intact? Because I think I've seen a sketch that maybe John Light actually drew of the wreck,
Yeah.
and it does resemble a pretty physical ship lying on the bottom on its starboard side. What's your impression of it back then?
I can't answer that question because I wasn't with John Light in the 1960s. I was going to school still. And I joined him on the second mission, the early 1970s.
Oh, okay.
So I have no opinions at all about the early 1960 diving.
Paddy, in his archival research, what do you think was John Light's greatest single discovery?
He made great inroads into finding out about the ammunition shipped. Cunard were playing a double game. They were trading as a passenger liner, and as such, the war was on then. As such, they were exempt from torpedoes and mines and all that because the Germans assumed that the ship was neutral, which it wasn't. It was a hostile ship because they were shipping bullets all the time. On the final voyage, the Lusitania shipped 3.2 million Remington rifle cartridges. Now, the Germans knew very well that the end use of those cartridges was to shoot German soldiers in the war front and create widows and orphans back in Germany. Also, he shipped 55 tons of shrapnel shells. They filled 2 cars of a freight train, but they were only the part of the shell. The shells were not complete. What they shipped was the projectile. The timer fuse was not fitted. That was blanked off again, blank cap. So that consignment was non-explosive. It could not have exploded. It had no explosives in it. It was consigned to the Royal Laboratory in Woolwich, where the shells would be completed. In Woolwich, they would hitch on the brass case, the nose cone timer fuse, and fill the shell with explosive. Mm-hmm. No, other items then, they also had 3,200 percussion fuses, which would go on the nose of the shell, and the gunner in the First World War would have to try and guess how far away the enemy was, and they would count that in seconds from experience. So when they would fire a shell, they might set the timer fuse for 4 seconds or 5 seconds to do the maximum damage and to explode over the target. Because First World War was mainly fought in the trenches. Rifles were no good. Everybody was below ground. So that focused everybody on shrapnel shells, an air bursting shell that you fire over the enemy, and it's time to explode over his head, and that would have a killing and maiming range of about 60 feet.
Paddy, for those who don't already know, talk to us for a few minutes about Room 40 and what were they doing?
Intelligence department, they gather information, and Germany were on the wireless all the time. Morse code and encoded words, it was meaningless. But there was an event happened up in the Baltic in fog. A British ship came too near two Russian warships, and the Russians blew it out of the water. They opened fire with the guns and all that. Some sailors were drowned. But in rummaging around, they found the code books to break the code, Room 40 code. And they contacted England, London, and told them about their find. So this shipbuilder guy especially, he got the code books then, and they were now able to eavesdrop on all German communications. U-boats, merchant ships, warships, whatever. The Germans had a habit of using their wireless quite a lot. And by using their wireless on Morse code, they were betraying their position. Now the Room 40 was a room created in the Admiralty to deal with this gift that they got from the Russians. And it was called Room 40. They were supposed to invent a name for it, but they never did. It was just called Room 40.
So in a way, Room 40 in World War I was the equivalent of Bletchley Park in World War II?
It was.
Okay.
The one snag about Room 40 is the head guy, Fisher, an old aging admiral. He was so secret that he wasn't sharing information. Admiral Fisher, and he would be privileged. He would see telegrams, decodes, and translated into English, whatever. But he would water way down the meaning every time. And he failed to report the 2 days before Lusitania. The Earl of Latham was torpedoed and sank. The Candidate torpedoed, the Centurion near miss. None of that information was passed on to the oncoming Lusitania, heading into the very same waters. It was really heading into a trap. However, the Admiralty took great care to warn their warships to get them into Cove or get them into Milford Haven, get them off the seas. But first, Fisher, again, he was eventually sacked from the Admiralty, but he caused havoc for about 3 years, withholding vital information that would have saved a lot of lives and lots of ships.
That's very interesting, Paddy. I've actually, as a small aside to that, I'm actually reasonably friendly with a fairly famous singer-songwriter by the name of Al Stewart, and he tends to write historical folk rock songs. He wrote a song about Jackie Fisher, and the name of the song is Old Admirals. No, that was just an aside. I want you to talk about the Mersey Inquiry / Tribunal, but before that, can you clarify something for me? And it's slightly mixed for me. Did Captain Turner request a passage around the north of Ireland towards Liverpool?
Yes.
Is that true?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
He did, and there were 3 witnesses. when the ship made a turn, a body of men opened up cargo hatch number 2 and began pulling out suitcases on deck. They had the first sling a net filled up with suitcases, and that landed on deck. And just then Schweigel fired the torpedo. But he would not have been effective. It was when the Lusitania got an order to turn. It made a very sharp turn to divert to Cove, Queenstown.
Oh, he was going to go into Cove?
He was, yeah.
Okay.
Everybody had woken up, you know. There were ships being sank all over the place on the same waters. It was only a matter of time before they got it. So the Lusitania made a sharp turn, which did Schweigel a great favour, because he was far miles away from the ship. But the turn made by the ship then was in favour of Schweigel, at close distance, and he was eventually able to fire his torpedo 700-metre range, whatever.
Okay, and one last question before we start talking about the Mersey inquiry. There was a certain ship in Queenstown, and I think the name of the ship was the HMS Juno.
Yeah.
Now, apparently she was an old vessel, but why was that not escorting Lusitania?
That's the burning question, no escort. Previous to that, the escorts were sent out to mine ships carrying mules and donkeys and not mine stuff, you know. But again, goes back to Jackie Fisher. He was an old man, he was probably snoring. He was a workaholic, maybe short of sleep, he might be snoozing. But he was the one man in control. And he failed dismally.
Mm-hmm. What about Turner's experience at the Mersey inquiry? Can you summarise that?
The inquiry was a sham. First of all, Churchill was in charge of the inquiry, and he gathered up witnesses, and they soon got the message that they were only to say things that would be in favour of England. And they had to bring, each witness had to bring along his text, his script, and that would be examined by Churchill, and if it was leaning the wrong way, that witness would be ordered home again, not counted. He wanted favourable
so they were selective
for the public here.
Yeah. They eventually exonerated Turner, is that correct?
They did, yeah.
And he went on
yeah.
to serve a Cunard again.
Fisher decided first, and Churchill mainly, that he heave all the blame onto Captain Turner. And then later on they had a slight change of heart, and they glorified him again. They gave him command of a ship in dry dock, and he was given captaincy of the Mauritania. He never actually sailed on it, and he was shipwrecked twice the second time on the Ivernia. So he was pushing on a bit now in years. But the bad motor first, Turner couldn't face out in the street, meet the people, they'd kill him. And he was hiding in a bungalow someplace. And then they capsized the whole thing against him. He was a great man, he was a great fighter, and tried to cancel out the damage. That coincided with the sacking of Fisher. Well, he wasn't sacked, he was paid off discreetly. And a new man, a fellow called Geddes, he was in charge of intelligence. He was about 42 years of age. He was very, very good.
If I could, Paddy, I'd just like to focus on something in particular. The Project 17 team last year in 2021 imaged the boilers as being very intact. And I think originally back in 1993, going through the book, Robert Ballard highlighted this as well. So there was only one torpedo involved.
Yeah.
Which is, that's not contested, right? So the second explosion was the one that sealed the fate of Lusitania and brought it down so quickly.
Yeah.
In your opinion, with the images of the boilers intact, and yet this very rapid sinking, do you think that the culprit was the aluminium dust powder.
Yes, I do, 100%. Aluminium is quite explosive in dust form, and I made up a chamber to verify that. It is chamber, and it exploded a spoonful of aluminium powder. You disturb it first to make it cloud, and then it spark, and it explodes violently. And the aluminium explosion is white, very white, very dazzling, which indicates very high temperature.
Mm-hmm.
But
and this was observed by the survivors.
I'm not sure how well it would be below water, but one woman mentioned a white cloud rising up skywards. But beyond that, it's all confusion.
I just want to just highlight something in your book that I had previously not known of, and that was a consignment of animal pelts that was washed up on the shores around the Old Head into Cormac, Kinsale.
Yeah.
Tell the listeners the significance of that, in your opinion.
That was quite legal. It was on the cargo manifest before it left New York. Animal pelts, all that was described in great detail. It had no connection with the war, and it was consigned to pelts for making fur coats. Anyway, they were gathered off the Old Head then and brought into Cork. Roy Hughes, I went out to visit the house. It's out the Carrigrohan Road. But they washed all the pelts, hung them up to dry, and resold them back again to the Admiralty.
Okay. It's because some people were speculating that for that entire consignment of pelts to be released from the ship, that it must have come through a very, very large hole, because you imagine these things kind of congeal together.
I quite agree, yeah.
Okay.
The bottom must have blown out of the ship, but unfortunately the Lusitania is lying over the hole, lying over the damage.
She's hiding the secrets, yeah?
Bits of the galley cargo have fallen out and have been found by divers, namely brass rods used in machine workshops, and copper bars as well, copper ingots. Nobody has found the shell yet. The 3,200 fuses are way back aft by second class, first class, that joint there. And I'm not sure why they were shipped back there. Well, again, they were empty fuses, inert, could not have caused any explosion.
Right. Yeah. Paddy, Ocean Engineering, as you probably know, conducted a fairly extensive salvage. I think it was 1982. Lusitania had 4 propellers. There's one still there with her, on the starboard side. 3 propellers came off, and I heard 2 anchors came off, and by came off I mean were raised to the surface.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard accounts as to where those anchors, which are very, very large items, who got them? Where are they to this day?
I don't know. I believe there's one in the Merseyside Maritime Museum. There's also one propeller in Merseyside Maritime Museum. It's 4-bladed.
Yeah.
The original propellers were 3. And it's on an open plaza by the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. You can walk by public park. And
the anchors themselves, as I said, there was 2 anchors raised. Do you know anything about the anchors?
I don't know. I have no idea. I think America, but that's only a hunch. I have no idea where they went.
One of the great sins in that salvage, in my opinion, was that one of the propellers was melted down for, believe it or not, golf clubs. Have you heard that story?
I have, yeah. I would take it with a grain of salt, you know.
Yeah, I've actually seen a photograph of the golf clubs with Lusitania stamped on them. Apparently they weren't very good.
Yeah.
If you're a golfer.
I don't know. I don't golf.
Okay, Paddy O'Sullivan, once again, I want to thank you ever so much for opening your door and bearing with us for the last 20 minutes or so. And everything they said about you is correct and true. Your accounts of Lusitania are beyond fascinating, and you are indeed the paragon of all things Lusitania. So we thank you profoundly again for giving us this time today. Thank you very much, Paddy.
Thank you very much indeed. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.